Welcome back. Today we're making this adorable funfetti Oreo cat cake. So this cake is very specific, but it's for my husband's birthday. He loves these flavors and he also loves cats. So I have three 8-inch funfetti Oreo cake layers here that are at room temperature. They are baked and fully cooled, and I'm trimming the sides at a tapered angle with a serrated knife. This is going to make it easier for us to create that spherical shape for our cat's head, and it's a lot easier to do this ahead of time as opposed to doing it once the layers are stacked. So once my cake layers are ready to go, I added a generous dab of buttercream onto my greaseproof cake board and I started building. So I started with my bottom cake layer that had been cut towards the center, and I added a very generous layer of caramel buttercream on top of this. My husband also loves caramel frosting, it's his favorite, but if you prefer vanilla or you think this is too many flavors, you can totally use my classic American buttercream recipe. So between each cake layer, I'm also adding some crushed Oreos and sprinkles, just like what's in the cake. I love adding that because I think it adds a great texture and really just reminds you of exactly what flavors you're eating. So I repeated this process with my second cake layer, and you can see my cake layers are actually at room temperature, so they're sliding a tiny bit. This buttercream is also a little bit softer than my standard buttercream, just because the caramel makes it a little bit thinner. So there's going to be a little bit more sliding, but don't worry, once we crumb coat the cake, everything will be locked in place. So once I had assembled my 3 cake layers, I was ready to start working on my crumb coat. I am a top-down kind of girl, and I like to start by adding a lot of frosting to the top of the cake and slowly working it down the sides, and then of course grabbing extra frosting as needed. And that's exactly what I'm doing on this curved cake as well. So remember, for a crumb coat, you don't need a lot of frosting. You really just need enough to cover your cake layers and trap in any potential crumbs, sprinkles, or crushed Oreos. So I did a quick spin around with my small offset spatula to make sure that my frosting was pretty evenly spread. And then I also used an acetate sheet to get it nice and smooth. So an acetate sheet is just a thin piece of plastic. You can order them on Amazon in bigger sheets, and I like to cut them down with scissors just to make them easier to use on cakes like this. If any of you are curious or want to learn more about acetate sheets, I'll include the link to the type that I use in the video description. So I worked my way up the cake and along the sides, and once it was nice and smooth, I popped it into the freezer for about 10 minutes until it was firm to the touch. If you want to use your fridge, that's totally fine, but it will take a bit longer, and I recommend chilling it for about 30 minutes. So then it was time for our second layer of frosting, which I'm always very generous with, and especially in this case since our frosting is a light color and you can kind of see some of those sprinkles peeking through in our crumb coat, you really need a thick layer to make sure that none of that shows through. So we're following the same process of starting with our offset spatula and then using our acetate sheet to get it incredibly smooth. So acetate sheets can be a little bit hard to get used to working with, but the key is just not to apply too much pressure and let the flexibility of the plastic work its magic along the curves. The other thing is just to take your time. This doesn't happen in an instant. I spent like at least 20 minutes smoothing that, so don't rush yourself and just enjoy the process. So once I got that frosting smooth, it was finally time to start making this cake actually look like a cat. So I colored some of my frosting orange and gray to add the spots on top of our cat's head. Originally, I did this by mixing my frosting in a bowl and adding it straight from that with a small offset spatula onto the cake. But in hindsight, you have to add your frosting into piping bags later to pipe buttercream onto the ears. So I recommend doing that first and then piping it onto your cake to create the spots. I think it would make it a lot easier. I spent way more time than I care to admit smoothing out these spots, and I actually ended up having to make them a little bit bigger than I originally thought. So do yourself a favor, add your frosting into piping bags in the first place, and I think it will make this step a lot easier. You also can clean up any edges with your acetate sheet just like that. So once our spots were on there, they kind of look weird without ears or a face, but I promise I think it's going to look pretty cute. So then it was time to pipe some frosting onto our ears. To make these ears, I just used some fondant triangles that I cut out. I stuck some toothpicks into them and secured them on top of the cake, and then added a little bit of pink fondant to look like the inside of the ears. I wanted each ear to match the spot that it was over, so I added frosting from my piping bags this time onto my ears and smoothed it using my small offset spatula and my acetate sheet. Those really are our key tools today besides our spinning cake stand. I use them so much. I also made a cute little face for our cat here with some black and white fondant and also a little bit of pink. And I ended up brushing some gel food coloring onto them just because I really wanted them to shine. You know, this is a cartoonish cake, and I feel like making the eyes glisten a little bit just makes it so much more playful. So while I was making those facial features, I chilled my cake in the freezer for another 10 minutes to make it nice and firm. So I'm adding a little bit of buttercream on the back of each of these bits of fondant, and they're sticking to the cake really well because it's chilled. So you'd think our cake is complete, but this is a birthday cake for my husband, so I decided to add a little party hat on top of it as well. So now it's actually complete. Now it's time to celebrate and cut in. This cake really does have a lot going on the inside with the sprinkles, the Oreos, and the caramel buttercream, but somehow it all goes together really well, and it was absolutely delicious. My husband gave it his thumbs up, and he never approves of anything. So if he likes it, I'm sure you will too. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you want to recreate this cake, the recipe is up on chelsweets.com.